Thank you, guys. Thank you for being so prompt, and welcome back. We do have a rather special panel. You heard me mention and called out regulators in my opening remarks, and so here we are, 3 regulators from around the world, just by chance. They were here in Washington. No, we've been talking to them for ages, and we're absolutely delighted for them to join us at this rather opportune time. So I'm actually just going to hand it over to Julie to introduce yourself and say maybe a few words about your roles and responsibilities.
Sure. Well, I spent 9 years of my formative professional career here in Washington, D.C., and Stephen and I go way back to the mid-1990s when we were shaping the Communications Decency Act, and I was defending Microsoft in the context of the US DOJ antitrust trial. I've been in Australia about 24 years, also spent 17 years with Microsoft, 2 with Twitter and with Adobe. And I've been the online safety regulator, the first in the world for Australia, for the past 8 years.
Brilliant. Benoit?
Thank you. Well, I'm Benoit Loutrel. I'm board member of ARCOM. ARCOM is the French audiovisual media regulator. And as I used to say, we are not the French online safety regulator. We are the French player of the EU team of digital safety regulator. And I've been working a long time ago in this city at the World Bank, being in banking, and then for a long time in telecommunication regulation in France.
Brilliant. Gill?
Thank you, Stephen. And thank you for having me back. So I'm Gill Whitehead. I have, for the last few years, been leading the implementation of the Online Safety Act in the UK on behalf of the communications regulator Ofcom in the UK. And I have also, for 2024, taken over from Julie as chair of our global online safety regulator network.
Thank you. And actually, we're celebrating the 2nd anniversary of the establishment of the network on this very stage, Julie. Why don't you tell us a little bit about why did you help to create it? What does it do? Who are the members? The who, what, where, how questions.
Well, I can say being the only online safety regulator in the world is a pretty lonely and daunting job. There was no playbook to follow. I mean, if you picture a peloton, you're at the front of the peloton, nobody's drafting behind you. You just have shrapnel coming in your face all the time, like pebbles. And so when we saw the prospect that we might actually have friends with Fiji, Ireland, and the UK pursuing online safety bills and forming similar regulators, we looked to the Global Privacy Assembly and ICPEN for the competition regulators and thought, we should build that because no regulator should be an island, on a big island trying to regulate on their own. There is so much more power when we do things together. And the way we started, we launched here in November 2022. We spent the first year really building the governance strategies and also explaining to stakeholders how online safety was compatible with a range of human rights, but also establishing the guidelines for independent regulators, because there are quasi-regulators. You could say some of the AI institutes may become quasi-regulatory. Some of the digital services coordinators are either traditional media regulators or they may be DPAs. And we really wanted a set of regulators who had a core focus on online safety and were at arm's length from government.
Okay. Gill, give us a sense of why Ofcom joined this network.
I think Julie describes it well in a cycling analogy, and I love a sporting metaphor. So I think that one works really well, which is, there is so much you can learn from other regulators who have broadly similar powers, sometimes similar, sometimes a bit different, but who are on the same quest and on the same mission as you. And I think that learning point is really important. But secondly, and I think if you're a regulated firm, this is really relevant, is the importance of coherence across borders and across boundaries where possible. And I think our view remains that we stand a better chance of ensuring really strong compliance with online safety regulation around the world if the regulators are joined up and sharing and promoting coherence where it's possible.
Brilliant. Benoit, you're a more recent member. When did ARCOM join?
We joined 1 year ago, and I guess you want to know why.
I do.
You want a candid answer?
Yes.
We have one specific reason to join, and that reason was Brexit. Because of Brexit, Ofcom left the club of European regulators, and from our point of view, it was really a shame. So we joined primarily to have another opportunity to continue working with Ofcom, because we have a tradition of very strong link between the French regulator and British regulator. So that's one reason. A second reason, more we look at this industry and we discuss with them, trying to foster greater accountability, we always realize when you discuss with them, they would tell you, well, okay, your idea is interesting, but does it work at scale? This industry operates at scale, and what we are realizing more and more is that we, the users, the citizens, the parents, the kids, we are not allowed to operate at scale in a way. And if we want to establish a balance of power with industry to induce greater accountability, we have to learn to operate at scale. And you can regulate at scale, and you do that by coordinating. So Ghost Train for us is an incredible vehicle to learn together, to add all our energy and not subtract them by this coordination, and have a capacity to operate at scale also, and to empower people at scale, just like the platform are doing it.
Brilliant. Julie, you launched with 4 countries involved. How many are there now?
There are 9 full members and about 18 observers, which is great. And, you know, like I said, going from one, 2 weeks ago, I was in Brussels at the European Commission, and they gave me the opportunity to present to all the digital service coordinators who are carrying out the Digital Services Act across Europe. There were 27. So we've gone from 0 to almost 30 in less than a decade. And I think that trajectory is going to continue upward. You probably saw that C-63, the online harms bill in Canada, had some pushback around some of the criminal provisions and online hate provisions, so they've split that in 2. So they're just focused now on setting up the Digital Safety Commission and looking at online safety for kids. So we now have members from almost every continent except North and South America. To get but the Canadians, Canadian Heritage, as well as C3P, the Canadian Centre for Child Protection, are observers. So they're benefiting from what we've learned in terms of trying to work with their policymakers and shape what the legislation looks like in Canada, and learning from us in terms of what has been successful and what's failed.
And the United States?
We've had many conversations with the United States. In fact, tomorrow we're partnering with Homeland Security and the Department of Justice to deliver a Safety by Design workshop. You know, Safety by Design was something that really I tried to move forward in the latter days of my time at Microsoft. It wasn't the right time, so as a regulator, I decided Safety by Design was something that we had to do with industry rather than to industry, so we agreed to the principles, and I felt like I was shouting from a canyon, the Safety by Design thing, it makes sense. It's like embedding seat belts or erecting digital guardrails. It's what we require of medicines, of food handling, of consumer goods. It can apply to the tech sector too. And we're really starting to see Safety by Design take off, and we're pleased to have more than 30 companies joining us in this. So, and we've had a really great relationship with the White House, particularly around the global partnership to counter gendered online harassment and violence. We hope that continues. If it doesn't, the sort of fight around technology-facilitated gender-based violence may move to a fora like the OECD.
All right, full disclosure, FOSI is an observer of this network, so obviously big supporter. And we've been talking to our friends in the administration. In fact, we're going to be talking to the head of NTIA right after this panel, whose own report suggested that the United States join as an observer. So I'll bring it up with Alan on your behalf. You mentioned something, and I think the term is regulatory coherence, and that's been a focus of your chairmanship. What does that actually look like?
So what we've tried to do, so I'd say aside from Julie, where you're much more established as an online safety regulator than perhaps the rest of us has been, this year has been really defined by implementing a lot of online safety regulation in other countries around the world. And as we've done that, we've taken the time to map out our regimes very clearly, and we've published that mapping. So you can all see where do we have powers in common and where do we have differences. And where we have powers in common, that's where I think is the potential to be able to offer more coherent approaches that mean, from your perspective, if you're a regulated firm, you can offer something to regulators that might apply in many countries, therefore reducing some of the workload your end and hopefully ensuring a path to compliance. Now, looking at some of those examples, for example, we all have powers in risk assessment. So a lot of online safety regulation starts with the concept of a risk assessment. There are many of us who have transparency powers, which means that firms will be, some already are, but many more countries will be requiring more transparency reporting of regulated firms going forward. Some countries have individual complaints regimes. Ofcom doesn't, but many countries do. So just looking at, so what we've started to, having done the mapping of understanding where do we have powers that are similar, we have then started working groups of people who are implementing those powers in their respective countries to look at what could be done on a more common basis. And I think that for what is an absolute global problem, where we can look for global solutions and a sense of harmonization can help. I was really interested to hear your call for harmonization of parental controls this morning, which I think would also be very welcome, certainly for me as a parent, but also from a regulatory perspective.
Brilliant. Benoit, how do you see it? This idea, this concept of regulatory coherence. Do you agree with everything Gill said, or is there more?
No, definitely, because this industry is global, and we don't want to split it in pieces. We recognize that the capacity to bring innovation, product is directly related to the fact they operate on a global basis. So there is a risk if we don't coordinate that regulation will split it in pieces. It will be inefficient. And I think for the time being, so far so good, we are moving away from that risk. We have this risk-based approach, which is clearly, the objective is not to tell the company what they should do, but to induce a greater accountability so that we get the safety by design. So in a way, there's a kind of red line saying we should not try as regulator to touch the product. We want the company to still have full control of the product, but receive coherent regulatory signals saying, please deliver better product, safer by design. That's really the objective, not to lose the energy by splitting the internet in pieces.
Okay. You know, I referenced the social and political upheaval that's going on around the world. Your own country has got a little bit of upheaval going on. I'm sure you've noticed. How...
Don't ask me who is my prime minister.
How does that impact a regulator when the government of the day is, or does it? Are you that independent that it doesn't really matter?
Well, I guess being an online safety regulator is something quite unique in a way. I've been for a long time a telecommunication regulator. Governments, politicians will delegate the issue to you, say, please fix it. That doesn't work for online safety, because online safety is too important. It impacts everybody. What we are hearing, I guess in France, we are hearing in all countries, is that there is a feeling that children are at risk on the internet, and politicians are doing their job, which is to represent their voters. So clearly, we have to work with them. We want to work with them. We need their energy. So on some issues, I'm convinced we cannot succeed, the regulators alone. You mentioned this morning, earlier, parental control. And for the time being, I guess you have as many parental control as you have as many applications, which cannot work. No parent can deal with that. We want interoperability. We won't get it just by regulation. We need the political momentum of the politician asking for
It's the
something
president, it's fine.
asking an initiative from the industry, typically exactly which is what happened in the Christchurch call, when at some point the politician came in saying, enough is enough, we want to move from the industry. And we think we are not that close from that, but we need their involvement.
Brilliant. Julie, I also referenced something in my opening remarks, which was the Australian ban on under-16s for social media. I guess it's kind of an elephant in the room. Would love to address it if you're willing. What are your thoughts about it?
To take from your earlier literature review, I've become an anxious regulator whose job has totally been rewired. And really what I mean by that is, it was really interesting hearing from Kantar because it made me realize how much online safety and regulation of the tech sector is really governed by the values of a country and a parliament and where levels of trust sit. So in Australia, there was a very well publicized research that showed that 84% of Australians don't trust big tech, and they believe that they should have a social license to operate and should abide by our laws. They were defined as an extractive industry, taking data and revenue, but not abiding by our laws, and that probably had something to do with the case we had against X Corp around their refusal to remove terrorist content video when all the other companies did so. But also 80% supported having a regulator for online safety. And I think, again, we've kind of been routinized into daily Australian life. They don't see us as threatening their freedom of speech or suppressing that. They see us as someplace they can go when their children are being cyberbullied or their intimate images are online. So we've just done a huge Online Safety Act review and really cherry picking some of the best elements of the DSA and the UK Online Safety Bill. But there was a huge political momentum, a political juggernaut that was really driven by a News Corporation campaign called 36 Months. So let's raise the age of social media access to 16, and it may or may not have had something to do with the dispute they had with Meta around the news media bargaining code. But the premiers in 2 states took this on. They're like the governors, and they were in the ruling Labour Party. And one said, let's make the age 14. Another said 15, and we'll do parental consent here. And then the opposition federal party came out and said, if we're elected next year, we will, institute this in 100 days. And so the prime minister needed to move quickly, seeing all this momentum, and so passed a bill very quickly. And as many people noted, there was an adequate consultation. We have a youth advisory council, and they did input into the process, as did we. It's not really a social media ban. I look at it as a social media restriction bill, and because everything is so vague, the power or the task will be given to me and working with my minister to figure out how this works. So my commitment to the industry and the mental health advocates and the youth and the academics is that consultation is going to be our first plan of action. I mean, age verification isn't new. Remember the Internet Safety Technical Task Force in 2008? We spent 2 years working on an age verification roadmap where we recommended in March 2023 that we do an age verification trial first, and once we have that data, then we move to mandates. That wasn't accepted. There was a lot of pushback from the child protection sector. So the same week that the bill was passed, the age verification trial started. So in some ways, we've got 12 months to build the plane as we fly it. But we'll stay close, and I think the technology has evolved immensely, as has the ecosystem. But we need to decide what the criteria is we're going to apply to age-restricted social media sites. And that is where, because I take complaints and we have regulatory insights, we can provide some evidence to the minister about who's in and who's out. And I think there will be a focus on dark patterns and opaque algorithms and addictive design features. Gaming and messaging platforms are exempted, explaining what that is, as we're seeing a morphing of these things. You think about WhatsApp, for instance, used to be pure messaging, now they have channels. So the distinctions aren't very clear. So we're gonna have to thread the needle very carefully. And the first thing I said when this came out is I talked about Australia in terms of excelling in water safety, and that was as a result of tragic backyard drownings in swimming pools. So in Australia, we require fencing around pools, and we back that with enforcement. So we try and keep those spaces where you know kids are in safer. But we don't try and fence the ocean because it's somewhat futile. But what we do is we teach kids to swim at the earliest age, and they're taught in school and they're taught at home all the way until they're very strong swimmers. They know how to tackle an algorithmic rip and not try and swim against it. We have shark nets where there are predators. We teach them to swim between the flags, and we have lifeguards. But the digital literacy piece and the education piece is going to be critical for us, and making sure that the unintended consequences of particularly kids from vulnerable communities who feel more online, they feel more comfortable than they do in the real world, and they can find their tribe. That won't be totally negated because of the gaming and messaging opportunities. So it is a bold social experiment. I'm going to, I've got an incredibly seasoned team. We will try and minimize the unintended consequences and the risks, and harness the protective factors. And I'll just finish by saying, we know that 84%, based on our youth survey, of 8 to 12-year-olds are already online. And in 80% of cases, an adult has helped them set up an account before they have been 13, and in 90% of the cases, that's parents. So we need to continue enabling, empowering parents as well. And only 13% of those kids from 8 years old have ever been suspended for age-related issues. So a really important safety by design intervention here is applying age assurance technologies that are more robust than just age gating. And so it'll be a challenge, but one we'll have to take on and do the best we can.
Well, let's all invite her back next year, folks. What do you think? We will watch this carefully. If anyone could thread that needle, Julie, it will probably be you. But my goodness, well, let me ask the other regulators on the stage here. We were talking about regulatory coherence. Is something like what Australia is about to do, would that apply in the UK, for instance?
So I think, obviously that's a matter for the UK government rather than the independent regulator to set that policy. What the UK government has said, that Peter Kyle said, it's on the table, but he absolutely sees the implementation of the Online Safety Act as being the #1 priority and the focus of all effort. And I think to that, and I think, we see similar trends to what you're seeing, and it is a sort of perhaps a bit of a contrast to the Kantar Google research from earlier. 22% of 8 to 17-year-olds in the UK have a social media profile aged over 18. And so they are experiencing content that isn't necessarily age appropriate for them. And then go even to the younger end, a quarter of 5 to 7-year-olds in the UK have a smartphone, and a third of those that do are using social media unsupervised. And we can see from our research that children are coming across pornography, often violent, stumbling across it rather than searching it out actively from the age of 8. So it's really important that the implementation of online safety regulation comes first. And that is designed to protect vulnerable children, to protect children who are not seeking out these sort of empowered experiences. And I think that remains an absolute top priority.
All right, thanks. Benoit, is France going to follow suit with Australia?
Well, I guess clearly the news came from Australia, so it triggered the discussion in France, and it will continue. But I guess it's part of the more global discussion on where the politicians are all saying that the industry has to improve quickly, that the capacity of the industry to match the content with the right public is not acceptable at this point. But I must say, I guess you have seen it even in the US, that as we speak, we have a more burning issue in France, which is how do we fight back pornography? You may have in mind we have this crazy trial which demonstrates impact of pornography on adults and children, and that's really a hot potato, and we're focusing our efforts, I guess.
Okay. By the way, I'm going to come to you guys in a minute, so think of everything you've ever wanted to ask a regulator but never dared. Gill, you just referenced the Online Safety Act. How's Ofcom doing in terms of implementing it, would you say?
It's good. I think in all fairness, in the UK, people have been waiting a while because the Online Safety Act, I think it was the most amended act in UK legal history. So it took 6 years. 6 hours, that would have been nice. It took 6 years to come through. And then, of course, Ofcom has gone into a period of consultation, which is really important, but it also takes time. The good news is we're now coming out of that period of consultation. And so the first regulatory statement, the first area of the Act, which is on illegal harms, will come in December. And then the statement on protection of children will come in April. And from those times, firms then have 3 months to do their risk assessments against risks of illegal content and then risks to children. And from that point onwards will be enforcement against non-compliance, which of course, if you have waited a long time for this act, is something you're really keen to see. From a regulator perspective, what Ofcom is really keen to do is to work with regulated firms, and that is the supervision function that has been built, which is really working very closely with particularly the largest and highest risk of harm firms to make sure that they understand what they need to do to comply with the Act, and that they are making and investing in that risk assessment process and investing in any platform changes that are needed in order to be compliant with the legislation when it comes to that point of enforcement in the next 3 or so months.
Brilliant, brilliant. Benoit, I wanted to ask you something quite different, and that's the issue of age assurance and how it relates to the topic at hand. What's your thinking? What's France's thinking on age assurance?
Well, I guess we are an independent regulator, and we are created independent by law, so we follow the law. And our parliament has decided we should have a specific requirement on age verification, and we are trying to implement it. We know it's going to be difficult. In a way, we may not be successful because it's tricky to deal with those issues on a national basis as opposed to on a global basis. At the same time, we recognize that's the only way for us to go through on our learning curve, to learn with the industry, because that's really at the heart of the issue. How do you design, develop a shared understanding and work together? As we speak, you may have noticed that, in fact, last week, Google made an announcement on an API on credential verification, which we think prima facie may be interesting. And we think that, in a way, there's a link between all those initiatives that are taken in Australia, in France, elsewhere, which are all sending signals to the industry, and that hopefully the industry will listen and come back with real proposals, because we don't wait for regulators to have workable solution in the digital area.
Yeah.
Clearly, we don't have the skills. I hope you know that. So our magic is to normally to push back on the industry and extract from the industry relevant answers. They have the technologies, they have the skills. We just have.
I've never heard that described as magic, but thank you, Benoit. I'm gonna hold on to that.
My pleasure.
All right, folks, who's got a question here for us? Yes, and if we can get a microphone here. Oh, there's one right behind you. If you could say who you are and where you're from.
Hi, David Sullivan from the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership. We work with many of the companies that all of you regulate, and have also been pleased to work with all of you in a variety of international partnerships. I think one of the emerging best practices we've seen in the space from industry. For example, before the launch of the Lantern signal sharing program was a human rights impact assessment of that project. I'm curious whether the Online Safety Regulators Network might think about doing its own human rights impact assessment in order to sort of see where there might be red lines or challenges in terms of inadvertent or areas where government cooperation on these very important issues could also sort of lean into inadvertent restrictions on people's rights.
I mean, I'll just say that even through the standards process we just went through, it's a disallowable instrument. These will be coming into play in December, this month, on the 22nd, and one of them deals with a requirement for end-to-end encrypted services to not break or weaken encryption, but they will no longer be absolved of not doing anything about TVEC or CSAM. So if we give them a technological exemption, they have to take reasonably practical steps to disrupt and detour CSAM and TVEC on their services. That went through, every piece of legislation goes through a process called OIA, where there's a human rights assessment. That particular standard had additional committee human rights assessment, and after 2 or 3 months. So it looks at everything from privacy to freedom of expression, and if it doesn't pass muster, they ask us to make changes to make sure that it balances all those. And I think the interesting feature of the social media age restriction bill is it has a specific role for the privacy commissioner. And then there have been amendments that stipulate that digital ID or government ID can't be the sole form of verification of the child, but then, after ID, you've got biometrics and some behavioral signals. That's really going to be the challenge, is getting that right. And in some ways, it's totally appropriate, because we need to balance those 3 legs of the stool of security, safety, and privacy, or we'll create other systemic weaknesses.
Yeah.
I just, sort of similar, but possibly at a more, just to illustrate how it works at a more granular level. So in Ofcom, we have a human rights team, and that team has the responsibility of assessing every single policy proposal and every single code measure. So at that very granular, and it has a sort of veto right, if you like. So at that very granular level, every single thing we put out is assessed.
Okay.
And maybe I can ask that from a European Union point of view, at the heart of the Digital Services Act, half of the text is just huge transparency obligation to force the platform to disclose what they are doing. And the idea is clearly to empower the civil society so that the civil society has a seat in this discussion on regulation and can react if at some point we have the feelings that some fundamental rights are compromised.
Brilliant. I think we had a question right here. Yes. Can we get a microphone right to the front? Thank you so much. If you wouldn't mind letting us know who you are, where you're from.
Thank you very much. I'm Catherine Brown from the Internet Watch Foundation. I'm very interested to pick up the point that Julie just started to touch on there around encryption, and I'd be very interested to know what the kind of regulatory convergence is around the risks of encryption and the increasing amount of material that's being moved into encrypted spaces. And one could argue a lack of proactivity on the part of tech companies in addressing the risks that Julie's just started to touch on there. So where is the regulatory convergence on this, and what more can be done? Because we're seeing a huge amount of child abuse material moving into encrypted spaces.
Well, we actually watched the UK debate around the online safety bill and the technical feasibility exemption to sort of define our response to make sure that it was acceptable. And, we had a lot of companies and organizations push back on certain things, and we listened. You have to listen. So one of the things that we did was specifically put into the standards that there were no expectations that any company would break or weaken encryption. But that doesn't totally absolve them of responsibility either. And there are a whole range. We do tech trends and challenges briefs so that we're looking 18 months to 24 months out. And we just updated that on age assurance, but we also had one around end-to-end encryption. So we're watching where the science and the technology is going in terms of secure enclaves, behavioral signals that other encrypted, end-to-end encrypted services like WhatsApp are picking up through profile photos and non-encrypted parts of the service, homomorphic encryption and the like. So I think that, and we're starting to see some really good innovations. The Apple team is here with their nudity detection on device. I believe Google has done the same thing. We've seen Meta scanning end-to-end encrypted services. So I think we're getting to that point. You either use regulation or you use litigation. We're seeing litigation happening in this space as well. But this is, again, where I think we need to come to the right balance and accommodation so that the criminal elements cannot continue to thrive and in the dark.
Benoit?
Honestly, I guess from an EU point of view, this issue is really a hot potato issue and is not an issue for the regulators to decide on. It's really a debate which is taking place as we speak in the EU Parliament, in the EU Council of Member States. You may have in mind we have the e-privacy directive, which has been under discussion for many years, and it's really the hot potato. We'll follow the lead. That's democracy.
All right. We have run out of time, but I want to give you each 20 seconds to say, what would you love to see happen in this space, say by next year? Either a technological innovation, a new law, a book that might come out to change things. Let me start with you.
I think there's a fourth elephant in the room, so let me start there. And I think it's around AI safety and the fields of AI safety and online safety, which I think intersect quite strongly, being considered as different. And they've sort of started from different places, and I think they're not necessarily converging. And in firms, they are the responsible AI initiatives and the digital safety compliance initiatives are laddering up differently. And I think that's a problem. And I think we have so much that we can learn from each other. We are, certainly as online safety regulators, we are seeing the harms of AI in children's lives today, and we're seeing that around the world. And I think that's only going to increase. So what I would love to see and help shape, if I can, and this is what I'm doing at Oxford Internet Institute, is to see much more collaboration between those two worlds.
Brilliant. Benoit?
We need interoperability. We need the big companies, the big tech companies to come together to a table with the civil society, with regulators to really start building on a handful of issues, a capacity to operate, interoperability to allow the users, the children, the parents to be empowered to deal with the internet. We've gone too far in having silos, Apple on one side, Google on one side, Meta. At some point, we need an initiative. And I hope we'll have it next year. If not, we are seeing the political energy increasing very fast.
Brilliant. Julie,
I'd just say the only way we can safeguard our children and our citizens is by learning lessons from the past. And instead of learning from the social media era of moving fast and breaking things, we saw the great AI drag race of 2023. So on one hand, we saw the same sort of, jockeying for market position. We'll figure out the safety issues later. But it also woke up governments to think about safety in a new and different way. And I think it represented a tipping point. So I would ask anyone in immersive technologies or invasive technologies like nanotech and AI to think about a safety by design framework at the front end and understand the risks and the harms, embed the safety protections rather than waiting for others to clean up, because the detritus is our citizens if this is deployed and you can't put the genie back in the technological bottle.
Brilliant. Well, as I say, we'll come back in a year's time and see how you guys have got on with your wishes. In the meantime, please join me in welcoming this wonderful panel.